Hi,
Hello, and welcome to Autocrat. I'm Vince,
I'm Cassie.
and this is episode 1, How the Chaos Began.
We're going to talk about mythology today.
Yes, and more specifically, the creation of the gods and the creation of the cosmos in general. How did we get to this point? Well, it's a lot more violent and has a lot more succession disputes, overthrowing, and, well, keeping it in the family than you might expect.
I can't wait for the chaos.
Yes, well, let's start with that actually, because before all else, there was chaos. There is a 1929 Greek mythology book which told me that Ovid said that before all else, creation was uniform.
Who's Ovid?
Ovid is I want to say a poet or something similar. He wrote something called the Metamorphoses, which are essentially a big book of...
Oh, yes, no, I know who he is.
Yes.
I know who he is.
Yes.
I studied him in French.
Yes, so that's where this is from. So Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Yeah, I know who he is.
Essentially, at the start of creation, everything was uniform. There was no earth yet, and air, water, and earth were all blended together into one, and supposedly a god called Chaos presided over this soup. So there isn't a suitable description of what this would look like, because light didn't exist yet, and that makes some sense, I suppose. I looked this up, and Ovid's text does seem to confirm this with some changes. So I'm using an 1889 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. So basically, at the start of time, the earth, the sea, and the sky were the only things in creation and were everywhere and the same. There wasn't a moon or a sun yet, and the earth wasn't yet suspended in the sky. And opposites were constantly fighting with each other, so cold was fighting hot, soft was fighting tough, etc. So I suppose a bit
light
like...
fighting dark? But no, light didn't exist yet.
I suppose not, no. But it reminds me a little bit of the concept of the Chinese yin and yang. So people call this chaos. Now, this seems to imply that chaos was this state rather than actually being a deity, but I suppose it can be both, simultaneously a personification of something and the god.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, let's compare a bit with other theologies and what they say about the beginning of time. In the biblical tradition, according to the New International Version, before everything else, God made the sky and the land. There was water first, by judging that the fact that the sky was made above the water and the land within it. So things are referred to in the text by where they are with relation to the water, so therefore I judged it already exists. The earth was shapeless and dark, and God commanded light to appear, and night and day were created, but there was something before the light and the dark. In the Egyptian tradition, again, before all else, there was a vast tract of water called Nu, and this seems to be something of a theme in several mythologies. Nu was also a god, and had Ra as a child.
What was he the god of?
Sorry?
What was Nu the god of?
I'm not entirely sure. I think it is just the personification of something.
What's Ra the god of?
Ra is the god of the sun.
Okay.
So I suppose at some point, for fun, we might have a look at Egyptian mythology, but for now I haven't really gone into it in any detail in my research. However, Nu was a god and had Ra as a child. Ra was more powerful than Nu and became the head of the gods. So Ra also has some descendants. Put a pin in that, we're going to come back to it at the end of the episode, because it fits in quite nicely with the theme of A overthrows B, B overthrows C, etc. So finally, let's have a look at the Norse tradition in the Poetic Edda. So again, before all else, there was a massive space, but it's empty this time, no water, so something different. The sons of Bor made the land and created Midgard from it, and Odin, Vili, and Ve were the kids of Bor and Bestla. So we're not going to get any further into Norse mythology, the Eddas, or other traditions, but basically
But we will later.
Yes.
Because Norse mythology is really nice. It's my favourite one, I think.
Yes, so I suppose there might be some contact with it as we start talking about, say, Germanic peoples. But the main takeaway is it's quite common at the beginning to have a sort of vast uniform mass, whatever it is. Making sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So Chaos was the spouse of Nyx, who, according to an old translation I found of the Theogony from, I believe, the 1700s, was also his child, and they ruled over the cosmos.
So what was Nyx's power?
I think Nyx just means night, from what I remember. Don't quote me on that, listeners, but that's what I remember. So I will point out there are different versions of the family tree here. I'm going to be going with the 1929 Collation of Greek Mythologies version rather than that of the Theogony, because they can differ quite substantially.
What's Theogony?
Theogony is from the poet Hesiod, and it's his account of the creation of the gods.
Okay.
So there's several different sources for this stuff, so Hesiod, Apollodorus, Ovid, etc., and we're going to be primarily going with a collation of Greek myths. So according to this old translation of the Theogony, Gaia, Tartarus, Erebus, and Nyx are all children of Chaos, although I should say the text gives them anglicised names and I've translated here, so it calls her Gaia Earth, for example. The fact that I'm going to be going with this 1929 version doesn't change our story too much, but basically there will be some discrepancies depending who you read. Anyway, Chaos and Nyx eventually grew tired of their power and created their son Erebus, so presumably you can interpret that today as them just being lonely. However, Erebus overthrew Chaos, immediately proving that was a bad decision, and married Nyx, thinking he would have more happiness with a co-ruler.
That family is really weird already.
Oh, already? Yes, we're 5 seconds into creation at this point. Now, the 1929 text by Guerber is careful to point out that with current views, this union is an abomination, and I find that brilliant that needs to be specified in the text.
Well, I mean, I guess there wasn't anyone else around, so they had to do stuff.
I suppose so, yes. There's very limited options when there's 3 people in the cosmos. But anyway, from what I can make out, this source, Guerber, or however you pronounce that, is only the second most blatantly Christian-influenced source, because the 1889 Ovid version, as an example, says that Prometheus might actually be Noah, and that the Greek creation story is inspired by the first 2 books of Genesis. So just that as a little flavour for what I think is Christianizing influence in the text.
Mm-hmm.
So, Erebus and Nyx ruled together until their 2 children, Aether and Hemera, overthrew them, so Light and Day, and these 2 kids were working together.
People love overthrowing other people.
Yes, they really do, and this is a theme that I didn't know existed until I read this translation, so I always thought the story started far later down the line with Gaia, as opposed to all of this happening. So anyway, Aether and Hemera overthrow Erebus and Nyx, and now we get light. The cosmos was visible for the first time because, well, light is around. These 2 wanted to make something beautiful together. However, they thought, well, we can't do it on our own, we need some help. And so they called their own kid, Eros, to help them. Now, a slight aside from me here, you would think they would feel like this was an unwise decision, given their own actions and that of their own fathers so far.
Yeah, they might get overthrown.
Yeah, the precedent here is don't have children if you're a primordial Greek god.
So does Eros overthrow them?
As far as I can tell, no. Together they create Gaia and Pontus, so 2 more
Pontus?
individuals. I believe Pontus just is the sea, or a personification of the sea in the same way that Gaia is a personification of the earth. Now, Gaia today has other more biological connotations as well, other than just being Mother Earth, because she is the namesake of the Gaia hypothesis created by James Lovelock in the 1970s. So this is basically the idea that the entire Earth and everything associated with it can be thought of as a giant living superorganism.
And I know you talk about that in your biology podcast.
Yes, for those who don't know, we'll probably get to this later more thoroughly in an introduction, but I also run a biology podcast, Biopedia, where I'm sure we'll get to this at some point, probably in 3027 with my current scheduling.
Go listen to him. It's quite good.
Oh, thank you. So anyway, we won't delve into the Gaia hypothesis any further, but just know it exists, and Gaia therefore has some implications for today as well, not just ancient Greek mythology. So Earth didn't have any life at this point, but Eros fired one of his arrows into it and life sprang forth. Birds, animals, fish, plants, the like. Now, supposedly, at the time of the creation, Eros also called the sons of Iapetus, who we won't get into yet, to give gifts to the animals and people the power to lord it over everyone else. Now, these sons are called Prometheus and Epimetheus.
Oh, I know that one.
Yes, and you will definitely have more to say about Prometheus in the future, seeing as he was the one you were such a fan of when I asked you in the introduction.
Yeah, I don't know who Epimetheus is.
Prometheus means foresight, and Epimetheus means hindsight. So as far as I remember, Epimetheus is the one who makes bad decisions and regrets it later, whereas Prometheus is the one who says, maybe we shouldn't do this.
Okay.
Anyway, at this point, because of the arrow, Gaia woke up, so she'd been sleeping beforehand, I suppose. She saw all that had been done to make her pretty, so the Earth having life on it, and vowed to finish the job herself.
That's kind of her.
Yep. She made Uranos, the sky, and supposedly gave birth to Pontus by herself. So this seems to be a little bit of a contradiction, so we already mentioned Pontus as being made by Eros, but other accounts, I think, have Pontus as Gaia's child.
Many stories have inconsistencies.
Yes, so Eros, for example, is either cited as having its origins this early in the story, or as being the child of Aphrodite. So there are inconsistencies, and even Aphrodite herself, who we'll get to later, has disputed parentage. Now, Hesiod says that Uranos was produced by the Earth.
Who's Hesiod again?
Hesiod's the one who wrote the Theogony, which, which is basically, from what I can tell, the big version of how this happened, so the mainstream version. However, apparently Aristophanes, a different source, says Erebus and Nyx made a huge egg which bore Eros, so their child, who then created the Earth. So you can see there are some inconsistencies. basically, up to this point, what we've had is Chaos, Nyx, and Erebus being overthrown by Aether and Hemera, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'll be shocked to learn that Gaia and Huranos overthrow Aether and Hemera in a stunning twist of events. Yeah. Now, these two lived at the top of Mount Olympus and had 12 kids, called the Titans.
Yeah.
The Titans apparently refers to the 6 male sons they had, and Titanides is the word for the 6 female daughters they had.
Mm-hmm.
There are some other children as well, we'll get on to that. Now, apparently Uranos was afraid of them and how powerful they were, and as soon as they were born, he threw them into Tartarus and tied them down in chains.
That's mean.
Yes, family issues, standard things that get brought up at Christmas reunions, I suppose. Now, there were 6 sons, Oceanus, Caius, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, who I mentioned earlier, and Kronos. Now, as a quick note, Iapetus and his consort Asia had children including Prometheus and Epimetheus, who I mentioned before, and Menoetius, who comes into it more during the Titanomachy. Now, the Titanides are his daughters. However, we get a bit of a dispute as to who exactly is included in that list of 6 daughters. So, mainly, we've got Ilia, Rhea, Themis, Thetis, Mnemosyne, and Phoebe. Now, I've also seen Ilia and Thetis swapped out for Thea and Tethys in the Theogony, which the Wikipedia page of the Titans corroborates, so saying these 2 are in fact included in the list. Now, Apollodorus has a different story again and says Thea and Tethys are the last 2, so picking 2 names from the 2 lists. Now, the 1911 Encyclopædia Britannica also says that Apollodorus adds Dione, which I haven't seen in my translation, so it's a bit of a mess as to who's actually in the list. The bottom line is, we're going with Tethys and Thea, and we're going to be assuming that Thea and Thea are 2 names for the same person. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense.
Bottom line is, listeners, all of this is a mess, all of this has multiple versions, we're going with one, and there's probably others. Oceanus married Thetis and had a daughter called Metis, who isn't very relevant yet, but will be, put a pin in her for now. Tartarus was very deep, and Uranos knew that his children would have trouble getting out. But here, let's pause a minute and say, who exactly are we referring to? Well, these 12 children were soon joined by other siblings, the Cyclopes and the Centimani, which Apollodorus says were actually born first. Now, the Cyclopes are called Brontes, Steropes, and Arges. They only have one eye and will later make Zeus's thunderbolts, and you've probably heard of a Cyclops, right?
I've heard about Cyclops, but I didn't know they made Zeus Thunderbolt.
Well, these are the Cyclopes, which is the plural of Cyclops.
And they make Zeus Thunderbolt?
Yep, they make his thunderbolts for him.
Okay.
We're going to come back to that in future. Now, the Centimani are called Cottus.
What's a Centimani?
So Centimani refers to someone who has either 100 or 50 hands, depending on who you believe, and they're strong and clever. So Centi, 100, and Mani, a bit like French main, or hand. So 100-handers.
Okay.
So these Centimani are Cottus, Gyges, and Briareus. Apollodorus says only these last 6, the Cyclopes and the Centimani, were thrown into Tartarus, while I don't think the Theogony really commits on the issue either way, so again, grey area, multiple accounts. Gaia protested, perhaps understandably given that these were her children, but Uranos refused to let them out. Gaia grew angry, went down to Tartarus, and told her children to usurp their father, which again is a bit of a theme by this point. Why stop when you've got a good thing going? Only the youngest was bold enough to do so, hating his treatment.
So which one's the youngest?
Oh yes, sorry. The youngest is Kronos, who the Romans called Saturn.
Okay.
He was the only one bold enough to do so because he hated his treatment, and the others were slightly reluctant. Gaia freed him and gave him a scythe as a weapon, or alternatively a sickle, and this was made of either adamantine or black iron, and Gaia taught him how to use it. Apollodorus says that all the Titans except Oceanus, so I think that means all 5 sons, attacked their father. Now, the Theogony has a little bit of a more in-depth version, and skip ahead if you're sensitive. Uranos supposedly arrived at night, proposing getting intimate with Gaia, and at this point Kronos sprang out from his hiding place and castrated his father.
Ouch!
Yeah, it's not pretty. He then threw the genitalia into the sea.
Because you do that.
Yeah, it's a bold statement. Blood fell to the earth, and at the end of the year were born giants, furies, and wood nymphs, and these furies are Alecto, Megaira, and Tisiphone. The genitals themselves foamed in the sea, and a beautiful nymph was born and brought to Kythera or Cyprus. This nymph is called Aphrodite, and that's where Aphrodite comes from.
That's where Aphrodite come from?
Yes, the goddess of love comes from this particularly horrifying story.
Do they call her something else?
She's sometimes called Kythera, which I think refers to where she's washed up. Now, Uranos was furious, perhaps understandably, and cursed Kronos, saying one day a child of his would overthrow him.
I mean, so far every child has overthrown their parents, so it's not a far-stretched thought.
No, it's less of a prophecy and more of a fortune cookie at this point. However, now I should say alternatively, Uranus wasn't the only one to prophesy this, and Gaia did as well.
Why would Gaia did that, since she's the one who told him to overthrow his father?
Gaia prophesying things becomes a bit of a thing later on.
Okay.
It's her thing. But basically she says you'll be overthrown in a future war alongside her husband. Now, at this point, Uranus called his sons Titans because of this deed, and apparently the common translation is that it's about people taking revenge, in reference to Kronos exacting retribution on his father. Now, Kronos didn't listen to this prophecy, which you'd think is surprising given the proven track record. He freed his siblings and became head of the gods, and the other siblings were brought back up, except the Centimani and the Cyclopes, so they were kept down in Tartarus.
Why?
I'm not sure, seems a bit of a strange decision. And the other gods made Kronos their king. Another way of looking at it is that Kronos throws the other 6 back into Tartarus, so either they were freed or they were just never let out in the first place.
Okay.
Kronos married Rhea at this point.
Who is she related to?
She is his sister.
Okay.
So he has a sister wife, Rhea, and the world was divided between them by Kronos. Now, at this point, we have a few more names to introduce. So Hyperion and Phoebe are also known as the sun and the moon, and their chariots ride around the world once a day. And Oceanus and Thetis are in charge of the rivers and the seas, so we've established a little bit of who's in charge of what at this point, as in the world's divided between them.
You would think Oceanus is in charge of the ocean.
You'd think so, but he is in charge of the seas, so I suppose for the Greeks that's
So he was
sort of
in charge
equivalent.
of the river.
Well, the pair of them together are in charge of the rivers and the seas.
It's not one is in charge of one thing?
I suppose not. I'd have to look into it in more detail, and I suppose that's more of a rabbit hole than we can afford to go into here. Now, Kronos' smug peace was shattered when a boy was born to Rhea.
Ooh.
Remembering the curse, he rushed to Rhea, asked for his child, and was given it, and he swallowed it, to Rhea's shock.
You mean he ate his child?
He ate his own child.
That guy's insane.
Yes, there's a bit of power hunger going on here, and he kept eating their kids the moment they were born, despite Rhea's entreaties.
Even the girl?
Yes, they had 6 children, in the Roman tradition called Vesta, Ceres, Juno, Pluto, Neptune, and Jove.
2 of those are planets.
Well, Jove is also known as Jupiter, in fact.
Oh.
Ceres is, however, a planet out in the asteroid belt.
Oh.
So, to use the Greek names of these children, we have Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus.
Oh.
And these are in birth order, so Zeus is the youngest. Now,
Zeus is the youngest.
yes.
The youngest
A
child.
bit like Cronus. Now, by the time Rhea was pregnant with child number 6, she asked Gaia and Uranus for help, because I imagine she was understandably a bit fed up of her children being swallowed by her husband.
Yeah, you would be.
Yeah, Gaia and Uranus took Rhea to Crete to give birth at Lyctus, in a cave in Dicte, according to the Theogony. Now, the heart of Rhea's worship was on Crete to begin with, so it does make some sense that she would end up there. When Zeus was born, Gaia took him and trained him.
I mean, she did that with the other son, and we see how it went.
Yeah, I suppose so. I hadn't really thought about that, but Gaia's track record is not the best. Now, Zeus stays on Crete at Mount Aegaeus, while Rhea flies back to Kronos at night. Essentially, Rhea hid Zeus and gave Kronos a stone to eat instead, which he did without checking it.
Guy's a bit dumb.
Well, so far he doesn't appear to be the brightest. So what happens to Zeus in more detail? Well, Rhea gave him to the Melian nymphs on Mount Ida, so the nymphs themselves are Ida and Adrastea. And the goat Amalthea suckled him, and apparently was rewarded by becoming a constellation later down the line.
Okay.
Those who worshipped Rhea, otherwise known as the Curetes, drowned out Zeus's crying by screaming, hitting weapons together, crying war chants, and the like. However, you can't hide forever, and Kronos later found out his son existed and was defeated and supplanted.
So you mean the prophecy was true, and Zeus overthrew him?
Yes.
Just as predicted.
It's a running theme in Greek mythology and plays that prophecies are not to be outrun. You cannot avoid them, don't even try. However, with one possible exception.
Why didn't any of his other kids overthrow him?
Well, they're inside his stomach.
Even Hades? I thought Hades was the god of something.
We'll get to that actually right now. Now, at this point, we will have to bring back Metis. She's the daughter of Oceanus, so she is a cousin of Zeus.
Yeah.
When Zeus was an adult, he asked Metis to help him, and Kronos was given a drug to gulp down, and he vomited all of Zeus's siblings back up.
That's disgusting. So they were just alive in his stomach?
Yes.
For years?
Yes.
I mean, those people are gods, so I guess that checks out.
Myths and Legends has a very fun interpretation of this, where there's a baby, I believe Hades, coming around giving everyone the inspection tour. So these 6 siblings then fought the Titans, and this is called the Titanomachy, which we'll get to in a later episode. Now, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the seemingly cyclical nature of who's in charge. So as you've seen, there's been a bit of a lightning-quick turnaround of who's actually king of the gods at any given moment. We see this again in Egyptian mythology. Ra created Tefnut and Shu. Do you remember that I said Ra had offspring?
Yeah.
Well, Shu and Tefnut are his children. There were then Seb and Nut, who were the parents of Isis and Osiris, as well as Seth and his wife Nephthys.
So we have a cycle again of people marrying each other.
Yes. But again, we also have the cycle of different generations of gods. So Ra spoke and made the land rise up out of the water. A god called Shu raised Nut up to become the sky, while Seb was the ground. Now, whatever Ra thought up at this point came into being, and humanity, for example, came from the eye of Ra. Ra becoming their first king. When Ra then aged and went up to heaven, Osiris became the king. Now, Seth, his brother, briefly usurped him, although we aren't going to go into the details of how exactly he did this. The point being, Horus, the son of Osiris, dreamed of a vision of Osiris who urged him to take back his throne. Horus and Seth then fought, and they were both wounded. Thoth cured them, Seth appealed to the other gods that he should have the throne, but they ruled in favour of Horus. The takeaway here being, in different mythologies we see the same theme of different generations of gods overthrowing or supplanting one another.
You will have to tell me how Seth overthrew him.
We might have a divergent episode at some point about Egyptian mythology. So, next time we will be dealing with the Titanomachy, the fight between Zeus and Cronus and the Titans against their children, the eventual Olympians. So how are you looking forward to that?
A lot. That's going to be so fun to look at.
It's going to be fun. Well, that's it from us this week. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.
It's been pretty fun. There's lots of chaos, but, as it says, it's really when the chaos began.
Yes, it really is, and there's so many intergenerational conflicts. It's a mess. I'm just glad I